Welcome to episode 286 of Sports Geek. On this week's episode, I will dive into our digital to dollars process. Know your value.
Welcome to Sports Geek, the podcast built for sports digital and sports business professionals. And now, here's your host who loves working with teams around the world, Sean Callanan.
Thanks, DJ Joel. Yes, my name is Sean Callanan, and you are listening to Sports Geek. You might be finding that on our website, sportsgeekhq.com. You should be able to find the podcast on all good podcasting platforms. It is on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. If you want to watch or listen to the episodes on YouTube, you can do so on the Sports Geek YouTube channel. You also may have found it via the Sports Geek newsletter that comes out every week. I do change it around occasionally, but at the moment it's coming out Tuesday mornings. You can sign up for that at sportsgeekhq.com/SGN. As always, if you've got a question for me or want to reach out to me, you can do so the old-fashioned way via email, sean@sportsgeekhq.com. Send me an email with your questions, or you might be asking about the digital dollars process, which I'm going to talk about today, or you can send me a tweet at Sean Callanan or at Sports Geek will find me. So what I wanted to do is really wrap up the digital to dollars episodes. I've done a couple of these already. The digital dollars process that I have discussed before has 5 pillars, and it's all about driving digital results for your team, for you as a rights holder, and getting more value out of what you're doing in the digital space. Episodes, and so the 5 pillars are: know your audience, know your content, know your distribution, know your value, and know your pitch. So you can go back and listen to a bit of an overview of Know Your Audience. That's episode 264. I'm going to put links all in the show notes for this, and they will all be linked on the Digital to Dollars website, digitaltodollars.com. But yeah, episode 264, Know Your Audience. Episode 267, Know Your Content. That was in February. And then 269 was Know Your Distribution, back in February as well, which looks at the different platforms you might be publishing your content. So you don't have to listen to those before you listen to this episode. I'm not going to say pause now and go back and listen to them, but they're a good primer because a lot of the Know Your Value is, hey, can you help us develop our rate card? That's the question I get, and that's what this pillar is all about, knowing your value. And normally what I have to do to really truly understand and review someone's rate card is to know their audience, know what content they're producing, and know what channels are working for them and their fans. And so that's the setup. That's the pre-work that's needed to get into Know Your Value. But I'm going to dive into the different ways that we go about doing it, how it can be delivered, and give you some insights in how we go about, I guess, solving that mystery of how do we build out a digital rate card. The final pillar is Know Your Pitch. And the reason I sort of wanted to kick off and do these last two that I had not done is that I'm doing the digital dollars workshops, a form of them, in the Sports Biz Zoom calls. So last week, we're doing them in reverse order because 2020 is that kind of year. We did Know Your Pitch last week, where we started looking at all things sponsorship and how you put together a digital pitch. That will be the next episode. But if you're a Sports Biz Zoom participant, you would have joined in the conversation last week. And if you're a Patreon subscriber, you can go and watch those 2 calls. So check out and please come along to our Sports Biz Zooms, I should say. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/Zoom calls to sign up. They are at Tuesdays. I think it's 11 a.m. now that daylight savings is kicked in here in Australia. So for my friends in Europe, in the UK and Europe who want to turn up, and also those in South Africa, turn up on those Tuesday night calls for Australian Eastern Standard Time, 8 p.m. But if you can't make the Wednesday calls, please come along to those. We get a good mix of European, South African and Australian people on those calls. But I do really need some really good, strong attendance on those Tuesday calls. I want to keep them going because I really enjoyed the conversation we've been having. So if you've been umming and ahhing or come to one or two of them, please come along and support it. And then Wednesdays. at 10 a.m., which is around 5 p.m. or 4 or 5 p.m. For the west coast of North America. So again, if you would like to come along and dive in more into the digital dollars process and just join in the conversation, I'm really enjoying having conversation with different folk from different areas of the world and different sports tackling the same problems. So you can join those by going to sportsgeekhq.com/Zoom calls. And if you're a patron subscriber, you can watch the replays. Really do appreciate the support I'm getting on Patreon. Appreciate John Barr coming on board as a patron subscriber. John, really appreciate it. And really appreciate you having me on your podcast, talking a little bit about hockey and OTT and all things digital. I will put links to John's podcast in the show notes here. And also, thank you very much, Nick Holland, former guest, CEO of EJ Whitten Foundation. Thank you very much for your support to become a patron subscriber. Please check out EJ Whitten Foundation and give them a donation as well. They normally would have a Legends game raising money for men's health, and obviously that has been affected by COVID. So if you can support them, I'd very much appreciate it. And if you could support our Patreon campaign, I'd also appreciate it. You can go to sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. And remember, you get access to all the Sports Biz Zoom replays, only available for the Patreon supporters. So before I get into this episode, looking at Know Your Value, I just wanted to say thank you very much to all the support from podcast listeners, both those who are Patreon subscribers, but also those who are reaching out with potential work. Really do appreciate it. As sports starting to come back, so is the work. So if you're looking at new content initiatives, if you need review on your social and digital and content efforts, if you need to develop campaigns, make good campaigns for sponsors, or you really want to dive in and take this time to go, how do we develop better, newer digital audiences and new revenue streams? I'd love to work with you. It may be applying the digital dollars process. It may be having a 2-hour consulting session. But let's have a chat. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/work. Booking a time for a call. I really do love and really do appreciate working with podcast listeners. So if you find yourself nodding your head on this podcast or other podcasts I've done, let's have a chat. So let's get into Know Your Value. So as I said in the opener, the Know Your Value pillar is all about developing your rate card, right? So it's developing a shared rate card for the digital and sponsorship teams. That is critical. Okay, it can't be one or the other. It can't be done by one team or the other. It has to be done together and it has to be shared. Why does it have to be shared? Because then it solves the problem, as I've said previously, the role that I play of digital divorce counsellor. You want to get everyone on the same page. And so what we look to do is to create an assessment of your social media content based on the fan engagement, industry trends, sponsor outcomes, and then the valuation can help frame how your sponsorship team will sell digital. So the rate card is both an education tool internally, so your commercial team knows what is of great value that your digital team is building or producing or potentially planning to produce. It doesn't have to be something that you've already done. So who attends this work and this workshop? Well, you obviously have your digital content editorial team because they are the execution people. They are the ones that are producing the content, producing the campaigns. They're the ones that know how to know your fans the best. They know your audience. They know the content you're producing and they know the platforms you're putting it on. So those 3 pillars earlier that I discussed of audience, content, and distribution. We obviously need the sponsorship people there because they know the sponsors. They know what the sponsors want, what they're looking for, what they're angling for, what they're attracted by. And also you need your data, your ticketing people, the people that know your membership base and that know your audience from a CRM point of view and from a data point of view. They're the ones that can do some slicing and dicing of your database to be able to effectively say who are the sponsors' customers, who would be targeting. You need all of those people involved in this process. It can't just be let the digital team decide, put a dollar figure on it and hand it over to the commercial team and tell them to go sell it. It needs to be a shared process. So the why, so some of the things we look to do in this pillar is understand all the metrics that potentially are there. CPM, CPE, CPV, all of the different TLAs, 3-letter acronyms for those who are playing at home. What do they mean? Which ones are important? Which ones are important in the cell? Which one? And this is a really part of explaining a little bit of digital to your commercial team. So there's that side of things. So you can explain things like reach and engagement, and audiences captured, and the amount of views on a video, all of those kind of things that are important. Like they're metrics that are important, but they're part of the picture. They're not everything. Then we also discuss like valuing your own IP. Okay, because if you just go with the numbers, if you just go with the stats, the valuation that you potentially put on your assets just doesn't stack up. Because the sponsor can come back and say, well, I can get that result, that views, that engagement by just using insert social media platform and ad product here. I can use Facebook ads. I can use Twitter ads. I can use Google ads. I can use TikTok ads. And the answer is, of course you can. And you need to have sponsorship staff to be able to have that confidence to say that. But why would they want to be associated with you, with your team, with your league? It's your IP. It's the association with your logo, with your team, with your brand. It's premium. And you need to value it that way. And you need to explain to your sponsors that way. And then the other thing is, you also need to realize how hard it is for a corporate marketer these days to get reach, cut through, and engagement on social media. Sports can do it because we've got engaging content, heroes in our posts every single time. So you've got to make sure you've got good. You want to make sure you value your own IP and explain that in your sales process. So in doing so, then we start building out the rate card and the bones of the rate card. What are we going to price different types of posts on different types of platforms? And when we start doing that, we also start looking at the frequency and potentially the scarcity of social media. How many posts are too many posts? If you're doing too many posts, does that devalue what you're doing? So we normally do this in a combination of what's the content you're currently doing, how many times are you posting on different platforms, and we've done this a little bit if you go back to the Know Your Distribution pillar when we're looking at your content matrix, like how many times you're posting. And so you've already had that discussion, and then you're doubling down on that to better understand and better articulate why you would value something a certain way and why scarcity is important. Because if you're just going to continually add new posts that can be sellable, that can have sponsor logos on, then are they really valuable? So you end up with a digital and social media rate card by content type and by platform. And so the outcomes of this workshop and this process is you end up with an internal rate card. That's very important. Internal rate card. This is not a menu selection item that you hand over to a partner. This is a internal rate card that becomes the internal building blocks for the deals. It will be a really key resource for the Know Your Pitch pillar, which we'll discuss in the next podcast. I'm going to do it next week. Some of the outcomes that are really important is understanding what platforms work for what audiences, to stop taking that main mass market approach to every single post, to every single platform. A post that goes out on Facebook goes out to a different audience if it goes out to TikTok. It goes out to a different audience. And Instagram is the best example. It's got different audiences in its different product segments. Certain people, the demographic that engages and works with your Instagram feed is different to the one that looks at the Instagram story, that is going to be different again that engages with Instagram Reels. So that's really important about understanding how the platforms work and how the audience is different on all the platforms, and also understanding the different KPIs for the different content franchises that you develop. So back in the Know Your Content pillar, you develop these content franchises, and you need to understand that they may have different KPIs. Not every single video is going to be all about video views. You would like it to be, but it might be more about comments and engagement. And then it becomes a conversation more around sales opportunities, around quality over quantity. So rather than just creating more of the same, there is an opportunity to create a higher volume of revenue with a higher quality of content, and not do it as often. So some of the questions, and I always like to put some questions in that make sense for a particular pillar. So some of the questions that this pillar answers is, what is a Facebook, Instagram post worth to our sponsors? What should I charge for an Instagram story mention? How do I price TikTok posts or reels? They're the kind of questions that we dive into and start to get some answers for. And it's not the definitive, this is what the price will be forever. And it might not also be the price that it is for every single partner. But it starts the conversation between your commercial folk and your digital folk to better understand why you're putting that value on those assets. So how can it work for you? How can you leverage the Know Your Value pillar? So ideally, it's step 4 of the digital dollars process, right? You've already done Know Your Audience, and you've developed a whole bunch of different audiences that you both already engage or should engage. You reviewed your content in the Know Your Content pillar and better defined what those content franchises do, who they engage, and potentially what sponsors they best fit for. And then in the distribution pillar, you've gone and looked at all the different platforms you're using, all the social media platforms, all the digital platforms like your website, and then also other comms platforms like email and potentially SMS. So you know how you can get that content out. So you end up building V1 of your rate card. You end up defining different platform content types on Facebook, on Instagram, the different types. And you start understanding that the value is also comprised of the costs. What does it cost to produce that piece of content that has value already? If a sponsor went and created that content themselves or got their agency to create that content and then handed it to you to post, there's a cost involved. So for me, the valuation and the rate card starts there. The example I use, and it's the example that I use regularly, is the James Corden carpool karaoke, right? Steal with pride. Change it, twist it a little bit for you and your car sponsor. Player in car, getting interviewed, driving along, doing 20 questions, whatever it is, right? That's a really good piece of branded content. What does it cost to produce that piece of content? It costs you your video person, your editor. Maybe there's some graphics work that's done for the opener and the closer. Understanding that is the starting point. So you can say, well, this is what it costs to produce. This is what we value it at in terms of what we're pushing it on particular platforms. Your Instagram story might be super hot right now, and so you bump up that price because it is terribly engaging. That's where your fans are. And if that's also where the sponsors' fans demographic or the sponsors' customers are, it's worth that. So it's about drawing a line in the sand and saying this is what it's worth. And then if you take that carpool karaoke example, how many times has it been done? Oh, that's going to be 6 posts, 6 Facebook videos, 6 Instagram stories. It's also going to go on our YouTube channel. And you just start adding up all of those rate cards across all of your different platforms. And that starts building your digital sales story. So it can be done with a half-day workshop on site to sort of dive in on some of the key parts of how you go about your digital sales and communicating with your team, how you go about valuing it. And so there's a lot of new there. There's even a lot of new just, as I'm discussing it here. And so it takes a little bit to digest from a team point of view. So there's follow-up work then to dive in with your digital team, dive into the analytics, dive into the stats to build out that internal rate card. And as I said before, it becomes the Lego. It becomes the building blocks for your deals. You can also do know your value training, a Q&A online. And also, obviously, the workshop can be done online because everything is now COVID safe. You can do online sessions to review your rate card and digital assets and to start that discussion. But normally, and the good thing about that is it normally opens up, it's a good thing about that for me, is it normally opens up more questions, which becomes more work, which is fine. I'm cool with that. So if you just want to have that pick my brain type of session and dive in on your rate card and how you've come about it, full disclosure, I will be pushing you back to go, well, who's the audience? How successful is that content? How are all those channels being used? Because just coming at it straight away from how much is this Facebook post worth is really hard. And you can just do metrics over it and say, this is what we think it's worth. And there are tools that do that. But I think it's partly numbers, but it's also arming your staff, especially the commercial ones, the ability to sell that. So it is available in the Pick My Brain 2-hour Q&A type of session. And also there's a Know Your Value keynote where I do dive in on these topics, 60 minutes, and I present, I guess, the keynote version that normally kicks off the workshop, which gives your team, a lot of ideas to start working together. But they're the different parts of the puzzle. That's what Know Your Value is. If you're looking for a silver bullet, if you're looking to hand over a whole bunch of data and a whole bunch of stats and a couple of sponsorship deals and say, hey, Sean, can you chuck that in a pot and come back with a nice sheet that says, here's what everything's worth? I'm not your guy, because it's part art, part science. And so for mine, it's about getting that art science embedded in your team and starting to realize, one, getting your commercial folk to understand what the opportunities that are out there. Because if they realize that certain partners are wanting to get on a hot platform, then you get to tweak those numbers. You get to push those numbers around a little bit. Whereas if you try to lock it all in and say this is the number and this is what it's worth, I think you just get yourself caught. So there's a couple of ways, there's definitely a couple of different ways to do it. I like the process that we go about in helping digital and commercial teams work together to set a price that everyone's comfortable with. But one of the really good outcomes of it is it also gives the digital team a real commercial focus. So they start thinking of new concepts, new content franchises, knowing that value piece and knowing that it can drive results and revenue for the team. And the other benefit is that of that internal rate card is, at least from an internal team point of view, it allows you to at least attribute sponsorship revenue back to your digital team. Okay, back to that point of knowing the costs of production, you're able to say, well, that's that video person has been paid for effectively by those 2, 3, 4, 5 sponsorship deals. And so they can you can directly see that work and that effort has brought in revenue. So it also helps with that resourcing of digital. So I think it's going to be super critical coming out of COVID to be able to justify numbers on digital. Like, I believe the digital team should be doubling in the next 12 to 18 months. But I know it's going to be tough because budgets overall are going to be really skinny. But if you can start justifying that spend because it's bringing in revenue, it's going to be easier for you to convince that to your CFO. So that's why the know your value is really important. One, your commercial team will start seeing the value explicitly of what digital is producing, but also so will your digital team. So if you're listening to this on Tuesday, very early, well, please come along to the Zoom call this week, because this week's episode on the Zoom call is the same topic, all about rate cards. So in the Zoom calls, I'm doing these pillars, part keynote, part discussion, part workshop. It's a little bit different because it's a wide and varied group. It's not everyone talking about their own team's assets, but it's very similar. It brings me great memories to the days I did it at Seat with 300 executives, with some awesome coaches, Zach and Jane and Jesper, that were helping me out. So I'm really looking forward to doing the rest of these Zoom calls. So please come along, sportsgeekhq.com/Zoom calls. And remember, if you do want to talk further about how we can apply the digital to dollars process with your team, please go back to the episode that I'm still very proud to stand up and stand behind, which is the one around how sports can bounce back. I do think digital will drive the results for sports in the next 10 years. I do think it will be the number one source of revenue for sports in the next, by 2030. That's my goal. I would like your help to do it. But I do think it also will help us bounce back and get out of the hole that COVID's put us in. So the offer that stands there of the digital dollars fast track, how can we get you up and running? That still stands. So please reach out. Like I said, I'd love working with podcast listeners. You can go to sportsgeekhq.com/phone call to book in a phone call. Other than that, Sports Geek HQ is where it's all at. You can check out Sports Geek Amplify if you're a sports tech business that you think can help sports bounce back, much like the digital dollars process. I'd love to profile you on the Sports Geek Amplify series. It's going to go into pre-production soon. I'm really excited about developing it. Some really exciting companies that are getting involved. And I think it'll be a really nice addition to the way that I'm doing the podcast. But also I think it'll bring a lot of value to you, the listener. So I'll look forward to releasing that and having your support on that. And also thank you very much to the Patreon supporters. You can support our podcasting efforts, our Zoom efforts, our newsletter efforts by going to sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. Until next episode, my name is Sean Callanan, and you've been listening to Sports Geek.
We'd love your support on our Patreon campaign. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. Want to help drive more revenue from your digital efforts? Book a time for a call. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/phone call.